Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk in this third nucleus about an interesting connection between several great figures of spirituality and education: Francis de Sales, Philip Neri, Alphonse de Liguori, Ignatius of Loyola, and Joseph Cafasso. Saints who, in one way or another, had an influence on Don Bosco. We do this in a very general way because of the time we have been given. This video will take about 25 minutes. A little assignment I want to give you is to listen to this nucleus and see and discover how the three fundamental elements of the preventive system, reason, religion, and loving kindness, are present in the spiritual and pedagogical influence on Don Bosco. We start with Saint Ignatius. Bosco and Loyola both marked the history of the Church with their pedagogical method and their approach to the formation of young people. Although they lived in different areas, Ignatius in the 16th century and Don Bosco in the 19th, we find many similarities in their pedagogical principles. Although they lived in different areas, Don Bosco absorbed some Ignatian influence and adapted them to his educational mission. Don Bosco's formation and spiritual exercises. Don Bosco, during his years of training at the seminary, and more especially at the Convitto Ecclesiastico in Turin, came into contact with Ignatian spirituality, especially through the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, which influenced him, his capacity for discernment in choosing which works to undertake, the idea of finding God in all things, which Don Bosco transformed into an education that values the everyday as a place of sanctification. Everyday life is a place where we encounter God. The concept of mission and active apostolate, which Ignatius passed on to his Jesuits and which Don Bosco adopted to form his Salesians as apostles of the young. Yet educational method, discipline, and accompaniment. Ignatius developed a rigorous educational method centered on discipline, study, and spiritual growth, described in the Ratio Studiorum, elements that Don Bosco shared, but with a more effective focus. Ignatian influence can be seen in the formation of the preventive system, while emphasizing loving kindness includes a Jesuit-like sense of order and self-discipline. The use of the personal interview to guide young people, the Ignatius practice of spiritual direction, the spirituality of magis and youth service. Another Ignatian principle Don Bosco adopted was magis, the desire to always do more for the glory of God. This translates into the tireless dedication of Don Bosco to the young, the creations of schools, oratories, and missions, and his conviction that education should be the means to form good Christians and honest citizens. Ignatius and Don Bosco share a dynamic and apostolic spirituality, rooted in the prayer but projected into action. Don Bosco, while developing a more familiar and affectionate method, drew from the Ignatian tradition to give solidarity to his work. We can therefore say that without Ignatius, Don Bosco would have been different, but thanks to his pedagogical creativity, he was able to adapt those elements to the world of the youth. Alphonsus Maria de Liguori. Don Bosco never knew Saint Alphonsus personally because the two lived at different times. Alphonsus died in 1787, while Don Bosco was born in 1815, so the two could not meet. However, The works of Alphonsus profoundly influenced Don Bosco, especially in moral theology, simple and popular preaching, Marian devotion, and attention to confession as an instrument of mercy. Don Bosco probably got to know Alphonsus' thoughts in his writings, especially the Glories of Mary and Moral Theology, which were very popular in the 19th century and were taught at the Convitto Ecclesiastico in Turin. The influence of Alphonsus' moral spirituality. Alphonsus is therefore best known for his moral theology, which sought a balance between the severity of Jansenism and the more merciful view of confession and grace. This perspective influenced Don Bosco in several ways. A positive view of God and salvation, based on love and not fear. The centrality of the sacrament of confession, experienced not as a judgment, but as a merciful encounter with God. Attention to the poorest and the marginalized, a fundamental principle for both Alphonsus and Don Bosco. The pastoral work and the missionary work. Both saints were great pastors and missionaries. Alphonsus founded the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, the Redemptorists, to evangelize the peripheries with a focus on popular preaching. Don Bosco developed the preventive system, which included evangelization through education and closeness to the young. The idea of a simple and accessible pastoral work with a language close to the people was taken up by Don Bosco in his writings and sermons. The educational method and moral formation. St. Alphonsus insisted on the formation of the conscience through gentleness and gradualness, avoiding both laxity and excessive rigidity. Don Bosco adapted the same principle, making education an experience of moral and spiritual growth through reason, religion, and loving kindness. Both emphasized the importance of spiritual direction to accompany young people in vocational discernment. Marian devotion and the role of prayer. Another common element was a strong devotion to Our Lady. Alphonsus spread the devotion to Mary as mediatrix of grace, particularly in his famous book The Glories of Mary. Don Bosco developed the cult of Mary Help of Christians, teaching his young people to always turn to her as a mother and guide. Both entrusted their works to Marian protection, seeing in Mary the key to the salvation of souls. Don Bosco inherited from St. Alphonsus a welcoming, educative, and missionary pastoral approach, with a strong emphasis on mercy, moral formation, and Marian devotion. We can say that without the figure of St. Alphonsus, Don Bosco would have had a less balanced approach to his youth pastoral work. Their common mission? To bring Christ to those most in need with gentleness and love. Francis de Sales. An idea that increasingly finds its way into Don Bosco's study is that his love for Francis de Sales stems from his knowledge of the works of Alphonsus de Liguori. In fact, thousands of times the Bishop of Geneva is cited in the work of Alphonsus. Here is a brief comparison between Francis de Sales and John Bosco, highlighting the pedagogical and the spiritual ideas of both and how the saintly Bishop of Geneva profoundly influenced Don Bosco. First of all, the model of gentleness and loving kindness. Francis de Sales is known for his spirituality of gentleness. He thought that love is stronger than fear, and that holiness is accessible to all, not just monks and priests. Don Bosco made this vision his own, choosing Francis de Sales as the patron of his work and inspirer of the preventive system. For both, education must never be repressive, but based on love and trust. The educator must win the hearts of the young, just as the shepherd wins the sheep with gentleness and not with force. Sanctity is for everyone, an idea developed a lot by Francis de Sales. For Don Bosco, this also applies to the poorest and the most difficult children and boys. 2. Loving kindness and the educational model. Francis de Sales insisted that God never forces man, but draws him to love. He said, nothing by force, everything by love. Don Bosco applied this concept to the preventive system founded on reason. Make boys, children understand what is good without imposition. Religion educating them in a life of joyful faith. Loving kindness, making young people feel loved, because education is a thing of the heart. Don Bosco used to say that a boy is best educated when he feels loved, a concept taken directly from the thinking of Francis de Sales. Holiness in everyday life. Francis de Sales was a great teacher of spirituality for the laity. In his masterpiece Introduction to the Devout Life, he teaches that everyone can be a saint in their own state of life. The priest with a zeal for the salvation of the souls, the merchant with his honest work, the mother of the family with her love for her children. Don Bosco transmitted this idea to his young people, teaching them that holiness is not made up of extraordinary things, but of fidelity in the small everyday things. This principle is summed up in the figure of Domenico Savio, who made his daily life a path to holiness. Meekness and the fight against evil. Francis de Sales was a bishop in a difficult period marked by religious divisions. He never used violent or aggressive methods, but the power of persuasion and goodness. Don Bosco likewise lived in a time of social and religious tensions, but he always avoided direct confrontations. He preferred educating young people for the good rather than fighting mistakes with controversy, teaching respect for all, even those who did not share his vision. Both were convinced that evil is overcome with goodness and patience, never with violence and imposition. Joyful faith, accessible to all. Francis de Sales used to say, a saint that is sad is a sad saint. His spirituality was characterized by joy, optimism, and trust in providence. Don Bosco transmitted this same vision to his youngsters, creating a joyful and welcoming educational environment where play, music, and sports played a fundamental role. For Don Bosco, faith had to be lived with enthusiasm and joy, just as Francis de Sales taught. Francis de Sales was a fundamental model for Don Bosco, both in his spirituality and pedagogy. Don Bosco took from him gentleness and patience in education, the idea that holiness is for everyone, not for a chosen few, the importance of trust and loving kindness to win hearts, education based on love, not fear, joy as a fundamental element of Christian life. For this reason, Don Bosco chose to call his congregation Salesians, in honor of Saint Francis de Sales and the saint of goodness and loving kindness. Joseph Cafasso, a key figure in Don Bosco's spiritual and priestly formation. Cavasso is not only a teacher of moral theology, but also a fundamental guide in the birth of the Salesian mission. Joseph Cavasso was a priest, a Turin priest, known for his holiness, wisdom, and dedication to the poorest, especially to prisoners. He was a professor in the Convitto Ecclesiastico, an institution that trained young priests in practical pastoral life. In 1841, soon as he was ordained a priest, Don Bosco entered the Convitto Ecclesiastico, and here he met Cavasso, who became his spiritual director, confessor, and model of priestly life. Cavasso taught Don Bosco a concrete pastoral vision based on God's merciful love, the ability to face the challenges of the city, learning to read the signs of the time, the importance of evangelization among the poor and prisoners. Don Bosco, even as a seminarian, had in his heart the desire to help poor and abandoned young people. It was Cavasso who encouraged him, supporting him spirituality and also with material aid. When Don Bosco began to gather boys for catechism, teaching, and outdoor games, he found many difficulties. It was Cavasso himself who defended him and supported him in front of his critics, saying, "Go ahead, Don Bosco, the Lord is with you." The influence on Don Bosco's spirituality and methods. Saint Joseph Cavasso was a man of prayer and great charity. Don Bosco learned from him the importance of confession and spiritual direction, fundamental elements in the preventive system. The ability to love the most difficult young people, as Cavasso did with prisoners. A model of priestly holiness made of humility and selfless service. Cavasso not only helped Don Bosco at the beginning of his mission, but continued to be a point of reference. Thanks to him, Don Bosco was able to find support to buy the first building of the oratory and give stability to his work. After Cavasso's death in 1860, Don Bosco always remembered him as a model priest and a holy educator. Joseph Cavasso was much more than a teacher for Don Bosco. He was his spiritual father and counselor and a concrete support. Without his guidance, Salesian work today would probably not have been born or would have developed differently. Don Bosco himself described him as a model of priestly life to be imitated and proposed him to his Salesians as an example of charity, humility, and dedication to the poorest. And last but not least, Filippo Neri. Saint Philip Neri, 1515-1595, and Don Bosco, 1815-1888, share many affinities in both pedagogy and spirituality. Philip Neri, known as the Apostle of Rome, founded the oratory as a center of Christian and moral formation for young people, favoring a joyful and paternal approach. Don Bosco also created his oratory inspired by Neri and adopted an educational method based on affection, reason, and religion. The influence of Neri on Don Bosco's pedagogy. The oratory model. Neri structured his oratory as a gathering place for young people, where they could receive religious and moral instruction in a serene and joyful atmosphere. Don Bosco took up this concept, adapting it to the needs of the 19th century boys. The importance of joy. Neri believed in the centrality of joy in the Christian life, favoring an education that was engaging and joyful. Don Bosco also adopted this style, making play, music, and theater essential educational tools. closeness to young people. Both saints lived among young people, sharing their lives and becoming affectionate and reference points. The influence of Neri on Don Bosco's spirituality, loving kindness, and spiritual paternity. Neri embodied the image of the loving and welcoming father, qualities that Don Bosco made his own in his educational methods. Simplicity and spontaneity. Neri was known for his simplicity and humility, avoiding unnecessary formalism and focusing on direct relationships with God. Don Bosco adopted a similar approach, making the faith accessible to the young people through a simple and familiar style. Charity towards the poorest. Both saints dedicated their lives to the most needy, seeing in them the face of Christ. In summary, Filippo Neri exerted a profound influence on Don Bosco, passing on to him an educational spiritual model based on joy, loving kindness, and dedication to the young. Don Bosco, while adapting these intuitions to his time, remained faithful to the spirit of Filippo Neri, embodying his own apostolic order. At the end, I want to ask you this little task to do, to see how these different saints had an influence on Don Bosco, focusing on the concepts of reason, religion, and loving kindness.